A flight bound for change. The early morning sun streamed through the terminal windows of Atlanta's bustling Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, casting long shadows across the tiled floors. Flight 620, bound for New York City, was preparing for takeoff. Among the sea of passengers, an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Hayes stood quietly near the gate. Her presence was understated, almost invisible amidst the chaotic energy of the airport. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy suit, Mrs. Hayes carried herself with quiet dignity. Her silver hair was neatly coiled into a bun, and she clutched a vintage leather bag in one hand. To the casual observer, she looked like any other traveler, a grandmother, perhaps, making her way to visit family. Few would have guessed that this elderly woman held a story that would change the fate of many lives on this very flight. As passengers filed onto the aircraft, the flight crew was already busy with their pre-flight routines. Among them was a young flight attendant named Amber. Ambitious and eager to prove herself, Amber had recently been promoted to lead attendant on domestic flights. She took her responsibilities seriously, but her enthusiasm often bordered on overconfidence. Amber glanced at her passenger manifest as she moved briskly down the aisle. She was efficient, focused, and slightly impatient, traits that sometimes worked against her in customer service. When Mrs. Hayes stepped on board, Amber offered her a polite yet perfunctory greeting, her attention already moving to the next passenger. Mrs. Hayes responded with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She didn't seem to mind the hurried interaction, and quietly made her way to her assigned seat near the rear of the plane. Settling in, she adjusted the shade on her window and folded her hands neatly in her lap. The aircraft soon reached cruising altitude, and the crew began their usual rounds. Amber took charge, directing her colleagues with precision. She moved methodically, ensuring drinks and snacks were distributed and checking on the comfort of passengers. Her movements were brisk, her demeanor professional but distant. When Amber reached Mrs. Hayes' row, she noticed that the elderly woman appeared slightly uncomfortable. The seat next to her was occupied by a young boy who was fidgeting incessantly, his restless legs occasionally kicking the back of the seat in front of him. Mrs. Hayes remained calm, her expression serene, though anyone observing closely could see that the situation was less than ideal. Amber stopped beside the row, her hands on her hips. "Ma'am," she said, her tone polite but clipped, "would you mind switching seats? This child seems to be causing some disruption, and I believe it would be better for everyone if we could minimize any disturbances." Mrs. Hayes looked up at Amber, her expression unchanging. Her voice was soft but firm as she replied, "Thank you for your concern, but I'm quite all right here. The boy is just restless. It's nothing I can't manage." Amber's brows furrowed slightly. She wasn't accustomed to having her requests denied. "I understand, ma'am," she said, her tone losing some of its professional veneer. "But for the comfort of all passengers, I really think it would be best if you moved." Mrs. Hayes remained seated, her hands resting gently on her lap. "I appreciate your efforts, but I'm staying here," she said simply. The interaction drew the attention of nearby passengers, who exchanged glances. Some murmured quietly, sensing the growing tension. Amber felt their eyes on her, and it only fueled her irritation. She gave Mrs. Hayes a tight-lipped smile before moving on, muttering under her breath as she went. The remainder of the flight continued without incident, but an undercurrent of unease lingered. Passengers whispered about the flight attendant's curt behavior, while Mrs. Hayes sat quietly, seemingly unaffected. Amber, however, couldn't shake her irritation. She felt as though her authority had been undermined, and it gnawed at her. As Amber passed Mrs. Hayes' row again, she noticed the elderly woman gazing out the window, her posture relaxed. Unable to resist, Amber stopped and asked, "Is there anything I can get for you, ma'am?" Mrs. Hayes turned her head, her eyes meeting Amber's. "No, thank you," she said with a gentle smile. The calmness in Mrs. Hayes' demeanor unsettled Amber. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something Amber couldn't quite place. As she walked away, she muttered to herself, "Some people think they can do whatever they want." Unbeknownst to Amber, Mrs. Hayes wasn't just another passenger. Behind her quiet demeanor was a woman with influence far beyond the confines of this airplane. She had built her life on principles of respect and integrity, and today, she had observed a glaring lack of both. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, the events of the flight seemed to fade into routine for most passengers. But for Amber, the tension hadn't subsided. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow mishandled the situation, though her pride wouldn't allow her to admit it. As the aircraft touched down and taxied to the gate, Amber prepared to assist with the disembarkation. She watched as passengers gathered their belongings and filed out. When Mrs. Hayes approached the front of the plane, she paused and looked directly at Amber. "Thank you for your service today," Mrs. Hayes said, her tone polite but layered with meaning. "I'll be in touch." Amber blinked, caught off guard. Before she could respond, Mrs. Hayes turned and stepped into the terminal, leaving Amber standing there with a growing sense of unease. Something about the interaction felt final, as though a decision had been made. What Amber didn't yet know was that Mrs. Hayes was far from an ordinary passenger. In the coming days, the consequences of this flight would ripple through the airline in ways no one could have foreseen, and Amber's understanding of respect, humility, and professionalism would be put to the ultimate test. The ripple effect. Amber woke up the next morning with an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. She replayed the events of the flight in her head, the curt exchange with Mrs. Hayes, the muttered comment under her breath, and the peculiar weight in the elderly woman's final words, "I'll be in touch." The phrase echoed in her mind, its meaning unclear but ominous. Amber brushed it off as she got ready for her day, reminding herself that passengers often made idle comments. Mrs. Hayes was likely just another entitled traveler, one who had no intention of actually being in touch. Still, there was a nagging sense that this was different. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos when Amber arrived for her shift. Flight attendants gathered in the crew lounge, chatting and preparing for their assignments. Amber was pouring herself a cup of coffee when her friend and fellow attendant, Mia, approached her with a raised eyebrow. "Hey, did you hear about what's going on with yesterday's flight?" Maya asked, leaning in conspiratorially. Amber froze, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning ignorance. Mia smirked. "Apparently, some bigwig passenger on your flight lodged a complaint. The higher-ups are already looking into it." Amber's chest tightened. "A complaint?" she repeated, her voice betraying her nervousness. "Who would have complained?" Everyone seemed fine. Mia shrugged. "I don't know the details, but rumor has it the passenger was someone important. Like, really important." Amber forced a laugh, trying to dismiss Mia's words. "Passengers always think they're important. I'm sure it's nothing." But her heart was racing. Could Mrs. Hayes have been serious about being in touch? Amber shook her head, willing herself to focus on her duties for the day. She couldn't let a single passenger's cryptic words throw her off. By midday, Amber's unease had grown into outright dread. The tension culminated when she received a call from her supervisor, Linda, a stern woman with years of experience in the airline industry. Linda rarely minced words. "Amber, I need to see you in my office." "Now," Linda said curtly over the phone. Amber's stomach churned as she made her way to the small office tucked away in the terminal. Linda was seated behind her desk, her expression unreadable. On the desk sat a file folder, its edges slightly worn, as though it had been handled more than once that morning. "Close the door," Linda said as Amber entered. Amber obeyed, feeling like a student summoned to the principal's office. Linda gestured for Amber to sit. "Do you know who Mrs. Eleanor Hayes is?" she asked, her tone sharp. Amber blinked, her mind racing. "She was a passenger on my flight yesterday," she said cautiously. Linda leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Hayes is not just a passenger. She's the founder and majority owner of this airline." Amber's heart sank. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and she gripped the edges of the chair to steady herself. The owner of the airline. The realization hit her like a freight train. The woman she had dismissed so casually, the one she had subtly insulted, held more power than Amber could fathom. I didn't know, Amber stammered. She didn't say anything. She didn't act like. Linda raised a hand, cutting her off. Mrs. Hayes is known for keeping a low profile. She rarely travels on her own airline, and when she does, she doesn't advertise her presence. But yesterday, you interacted with her, and from what I've been told, it wasn't exactly your finest moment. Amber felt her cheeks flush. She wanted to protest, to explain her side of the story, but Linda's piercing gaze silenced her. Mrs. Hayes has formally requested a review of yesterday's flight, Linda continued. She mentioned specific concerns about your behavior and the way you handled her situation. This is serious. Amber. Amber nodded weakly, her mind racing. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda sighed, her expression softening slightly. Mrs. Hayes is giving you a chance to explain yourself. She scheduled a meeting with you at the corporate office tomorrow. She wants to hear directly from you. Amber's breath caught in her throat. She wants to meet with me. Personally. Linda nodded. Personally. And let me be clear, this is not just a disciplinary meeting. This is a test. Mrs. Hayes doesn't believe in firing people outright unless they're beyond redemption, but she will hold you accountable. How you handle this meeting could determine your future with this airline. Amber felt a wave of nausea. She had worked so hard to climb the ranks, and now her career was hanging by a thread. What should I say? She asked, her voice trembling. Linda leaned forward, her expression firm. Be honest. Take responsibility. Mrs. Hayes values integrity above all else. If you try to make excuses or deflect blame, it's over. But if you show her that you've learned from this, that you're willing to grow, she might give you another chance. Amber nodded, her mind spinning. She left the office in a daze, the weight of the upcoming meeting pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. That evening, Amber sat in her small apartment, staring blankly at her laptop. She had tried to prepare for the meeting, rehearsing what she might say, but every attempt felt hollow. How could she possibly make up for her mistake? How could she convince Mrs. Hayes that she was worth a second chance? Amber's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find her roommate, Rachel, holding 2 mugs of tea. Figured you could use this, Rachel said with a smile, handing Amber a mug. Amber took the tea gratefully and sank into the couch. I really screwed up, Ratch, she admitted. I didn't know who she was, and I treated her like she didn't matter. Rachel sat beside her, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's the lesson, she said after a moment. Maybe it's not about who she is, but about how you treat everyone. Whether she's the owner of the airline or just an elderly woman flying coach, she deserves respect. Amber nodded slowly, Rachel's words sinking in. She realized now that her mistake wasn't just about Mrs. Hayes' status. It was about her own lack of humility. She had let her position cloud her judgment, and it had cost her. The next morning, Amber dressed carefully, choosing her uniform with precision. She arrived at the corporate office early, her nerves jangling as she sat in the sleek lobby. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one amplifying her anxiety. Finally, the elevator doors opened, and Mrs. Hayes stepped out. She was as composed as ever, her presence commanding despite her unassuming appearance. Amber stood awkwardly, unsure whether to extend her hand or bow her head. Amber, Mrs. Hayes said, her voice calm but firm. Let's talk. Amber followed her into a private conference room, her palms sweating. As they sat across from each other, Mrs. Hayes folded her hands and looked Amber directly in the eye. You know why we're here, Mrs. Hayes began. But I want to hear it from you. Tell me what happened on that flight. Amber swallowed hard, then began to speak. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to be honest. She described the interaction, her assumptions, and the way she had allowed her pride to cloud her judgment. She didn't try to make excuses. She didn't blame anyone else. She simply owned her mistake. When she finished, Mrs. Hayes was silent for a long moment. Her piercing gaze seemed to weigh Amber's every word, her every gesture. Finally, Mrs. Hayes spoke. "Amber, respect is not something you give because of who someone is or what they have. It's something you give because it reflects who you are. This is not just about me. It's about how you treat every passenger, every colleague, every person you encounter." Amber nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand that now," she said quietly. "And I'm so sorry for how I acted. I want to do better." Mrs. Hayes studied her for another moment, then nodded. "Good, because the real test isn't this meeting. It's what you do next. Actions speak louder than words. Amber, show me that you've learned." Amber left the meeting feeling a mix of relief and determination. She had been given a second chance, but she knew it was up to her to prove that she deserved it. And this time, she wouldn't let pride or assumptions cloud her path. A second chance. The weeks following Amber's meeting with Mrs. Hayes were some of the most challenging of her life. The conversation had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder that her role was about more than just enforcing rules or maintaining order. It was about people, respect, and humility. Amber left that meeting knowing she had been given a rare opportunity, a second chance to prove herself. But she also understood that the margin for error was razor thin. Amber returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose, though her anxiety was still ever present. Every shift felt like an audition, with her every action and decision scrutinized. She was hyper-aware of her interactions with passengers and crew, determined to demonstrate the lessons she had learned. But the pressure of living up to Mrs. Hayes' expectations weighed heavily on her, a flight that tested her resolve. Amber's first significant test came during a long-haul flight to Los Angeles. The plane was packed, and the atmosphere was tense. A mechanical delay had left passengers irritable before they even boarded. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin was abuzz with complaints. Amber, now acutely aware of her responsibilities, moved through the aisles with deliberate care. At the back of the plane, a heated argument erupted between two passengers. One man, seated by the window, complained loudly about the reclined seat in front of him. The woman seated ahead of him fired back, insisting she had every right to recline. The commotion drew the attention of nearby passengers, their curiosity quickly turning to discomfort. Amber approached the row, her heart pounding. The old Amber might have responded curtly, asserting her authority, and shutting down the argument as quickly as possible. But this time, she paused. She took a deep breath, channeling the lessons Mrs. Hayes had imparted. "Good afternoon," Amber said, her tone calm and even. "I understand there's a disagreement here. Let's talk it through." The man turned toward her, his face flushed with frustration. "This is ridiculous. Her seat is practically in my lap. How am I supposed to eat or work like this?" The woman responded sharply, "I paid for this seat, and I'm entitled to use it how I want." Amber held up her hands, signaling for calm. "I hear you both," she said, meeting their eyes one at a time. "And I want to make sure we find a solution that works for everyone." The two passengers exchanged skeptical glances, but Amber pressed on. She crouched slightly to meet them at eye level, a gesture that immediately diffused some of the tension. "Sir, I understand that space is tight, and it's frustrating to feel crowded. And Mom, you're absolutely right. You have the right to recline your seat. Let's see if we can make this work." Amber suggested a small compromise. The woman adjusted her seat to a slightly less reclined position, giving the man enough space to use his tray table. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to restore peace. Both passengers nodded begrudgingly, and the surrounding rows seemed to relax. As Amber walked away, she felt a flicker of pride. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction. A shadow looms. Despite her efforts, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Mrs. Hayes had made it clear she would be keeping an eye on Amber's progress, and the knowledge of her scrutiny hung over every shift like a storm cloud. Amber didn't know if Mrs. Hayes had assigned someone to monitor her, or if the elderly woman herself was quietly observing from a distance. Either way, the pressure was constant. It didn't help that whispers about the Mrs. Hayes incident continued to circulate among the crew. Amber overheard colleagues speculating about what had happened and what it meant for her future. Some offered words of encouragement, while others seemed to revel in her discomfort. "She's lucky Mrs. Hayes didn't fire her on the spot," one attendant remarked during a break. "Or maybe she's not so lucky," another replied. "Having Mrs. Hayes watching your every move sounds worse than being fired." Amber pretended not to hear, but the comments stung. She felt isolated, as though the incident had marked her as an outsider. Yet she also knew she couldn't afford to let the gossip distract her. Her focus had to remain on the job and on proving herself. The unexpected visitor. A month after the fateful flight, Amber was working a routine flight from Denver to Chicago. The plane was about half full, and the atmosphere was far less chaotic than usual. Amber moved through the cabin with a quiet efficiency, grateful for the relative calm. About halfway through the flight, she noticed a familiar figure seated in one of the aisle seats near the front. Mrs. Hayes. The sight of her sent a jolt through Amber's chest. The elderly woman was dressed in the same understated style, her silver hair neatly pinned back. She was reading a book, her posture relaxed. Amber's initial reaction was panic. Had Mrs. Hayes come to observe her? Was this some kind of test? But as she watched Mrs. Hayes interact with the other attendants, Amber realized the woman wasn't drawing attention to herself. She appeared to be just another passenger, though Amber knew better. Gathering her courage, Amber approached. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "It's good to see you again." Mrs. Hayes looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. "Amber," she said, her tone neutral. "How are you?" Amber hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'm doing my best," she said honestly. "I've been trying to live up to the standards you spoke about." Mrs. Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said simply. "Keep at it." The interaction was brief, but it left Amber shaken. Mrs. Hayes' presence was a reminder that her journey wasn't over. The elderly woman hadn't come to criticize or confront her, but her calm, measured demeanor carried more weight than any reprimand. A turning point. By the time the plane landed in Chicago, Amber felt a renewed sense of determination. Mrs. Hayes had given her a chance, and Amber was determined not to waste it. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future through her actions, her attitude, and her commitment to growth. As she helped passengers disembark, Amber noticed Mrs. Hayes lingering near the gate. The elderly woman caught her eye and gestured for her to approach. "Amber," Mrs. Hayes said, her voice kind but firm. "You've made progress, but there's still more to learn. Keep pushing yourself. Respect isn't just something you show, it's something you embody." Amber nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I won't let you down." Mrs. Hayes smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. For the first time since the incident, Amber felt a sense of clarity. She still had a long way to go, but she was finally starting to understand what Mrs. Hayes had been trying to teach her. Respect wasn't just about treating people well. It was about seeing them, valuing them, and recognizing their worth, no matter who they were. And with that lesson firmly in mind, Amber stepped back onto the plane, ready to face whatever came next. The weight of redemption. Amber's routine began to settle as the weeks turned into months. She no longer felt the looming dread she'd experienced after her meeting with Mrs. Hayes, though the lessons she'd learned remained at the forefront of her mind. Each flight was an opportunity to prove herself, not just to Mrs. Hayes, but to her passengers, her colleagues, and most importantly, to herself. Despite the progress she'd made, Amber was still haunted by lingering doubts. The weight of her past mistake felt like a constant shadow, following her even during the smoothest flights. She knew that redemption wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous effort, a choice she had to make every day. A chance encounter. One crisp morning, Amber was assigned to an international flight from New York to London. The long-haul flights were often challenging, but they also provided an opportunity to connect with passengers in a more meaningful way. Amber had grown to appreciate these moments of connection, seeing them as a chance to demonstrate the respect and care she now prioritized. As passengers boarded, Amber greeted each one with a genuine smile. She no longer saw them as a list of tasks to manage, but as individuals with stories, needs, and emotions. This shift in perspective had changed her approach to her work, and it hadn't gone unnoticed by her colleagues. Halfway through the boarding process, Amber spotted a familiar face. At first, she wasn't sure where she recognized him from, but as he approached, it clicked. He was one of the executives who had been present during her meeting with Mrs. Hayes. His name was Mr. Lewis, and his stern demeanor had left a lasting impression on her. "Good morning, Mr. Lewis," Amber said, her voice steady despite her nerves. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised she remembered him. "Good morning, Miss Harper," he replied, his tone polite but reserved. Amber felt her stomach churn. The fact that he was on this flight could only mean one thing. Mrs. Hayes was still keeping a close eye on her. The thought both unnerved and motivated her. She was determined to show Mr. Lewis, and by extension, Mrs. Hayes, that she had changed. The challenge. The flight began without incident, but as the hours passed, a situation arose that tested Amber's resolve. A young family seated in the middle rows was struggling to manage their toddler, who had been crying almost nonstop since takeoff. The sound was grating, and nearby passengers were beginning to voice their frustration. Amber noticed Mr. Lewis glancing in the family's direction, his expression unreadable. She knew this was her moment to step in, not just as a flight attendant, but as someone who genuinely cared about resolving the issue with empathy and professionalism. Approaching the family, Amber crouched down to their level, offering a warm smile. "Hi there," she said gently. "It looks like your little one is having a tough time. Is there anything I can do to help?" The parents looked at her with relief, though exhaustion was etched across their faces. "We've tried everything," the mother said, her voice strained. "He's just overwhelmed. It's his first time flying." Amber nodded, her own heart aching at their predicament. "I completely understand. Let's see if we can make him more comfortable. Would it be okay if I brought over some coloring supplies or a small snack?" The parents agreed, and Amber quickly retrieved a small activity kit from the cabin supply. She handed it to the toddler, who looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "This is for you," she said softly, crouching again to meet his gaze. "Do you like to draw?" The child hesitated but eventually nodded, clutching the crayons tightly. Within moments, the crying subsided, replaced by the quiet sound of crayons scratching against paper. The tension in the cabin eased, and Amber noticed several passengers smiling at the scene. Amber returned to her duties, glancing occasionally at Mr. Lewis. She noticed him observing her interaction, though he gave no indication of his thoughts. Still, she felt a flicker of pride. She hadn't just solved a problem. She had made the flight more pleasant for everyone on board. A new perception. As the plane soared over the Atlantic, Amber took a rare moment to reflect. The old Amber might have seen the crying toddler as an inconvenience or an annoyance to be managed as quickly as possible. But now, she saw the situation for what it was, an opportunity to show compassion and understanding. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mr. Lewis approached her during the in-flight service. "Ms. Harper," he said, his tone measured, "may I have a word?" Amber's heart skipped a beat. "Of course, Mr. Lewis," she replied, setting down the tray she had been carrying. He gestured toward the galley, and she followed him, her mind racing. Once they were out of earshot of passengers, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "I've been observing you," he began, and Amber's stomach tightened. "Your handling of that family was impressive. It's clear you've taken Mrs. Hayes' words to heart." Amber blinked, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady. "I've been working hard to live up to the expectations she set." Mr. Lewis nodded. "Good, because Mrs. Hayes doesn't offer second chances lightly. She sees potential in you, and frankly, so do I. But potential means nothing if it's not realized." Amber felt a lump rise in her throat. "I understand," she said, "and I won't take this second chance for granted." Mr. Lewis regarded her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Keep it up, Miss Harper. The airline needs people like you, people who can grow, adapt, and lead by example." A letter from Mrs. Hayes. The flight landed smoothly in London, and Amber disembarked with the rest of the crew. She was exhausted but satisfied, feeling as though she had taken another step toward proving herself. That evening, as she sat in her hotel room, Amber's phone buzzed with an email notification. Opening it, she saw the sender's name, Eleanor Hayes. Her breath caught in her throat. The email was brief but powerful. Subject: Progress ***. Dear Amber, I wanted to commend you on your continued efforts to grow and improve. I've received positive feedback about your interactions with passengers and crew, and it's clear that you've taken our conversation to heart. Remember, respect and humility are not just actions. They are a way of being. Keep embodying these values, and you will not only find success in your career, but also earn the trust and admiration of those around you. Your journey is far from over, but I believe you are on the right path. Sincerely, Eleanor Hayes. Amber stared at the screen, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and determination. Mrs. Hayes' words weren't just a validation of her efforts. They were a reminder that her journey was a continuous one, with challenges yet to come. Amber knew she wasn't the same person she had been on that fateful flight. And as she prepared for another day, she resolved to continue proving that she was worthy of the second chance she had been given, every single day. The true test. Months had passed since Amber's initial encounter with Mrs. Hayes, and though her confidence was gradually returning, she remained acutely aware of the lessons she'd learned. Her actions were deliberate, her attitude humble. Passengers, crew, and even senior staff began to notice the change. The whispers about the incident grew fainter, replaced by quiet praise for her professionalism. Yet Amber couldn't shake the feeling that a true test was still ahead of her. Mrs. Hayes' words echoed in her mind. Respect and humility are a way of being. Each day, Amber worked to embody these principles, knowing that one misstep could undo all the progress she'd made. A flight of importance. Amber was assigned to a high-profile flight from New York to Washington, D.C., carrying not only regular passengers but also several VIPs. The airline had partnered with a global conference on sustainability, and the flight would host industry leaders, government officials, and media personalities. The stakes were higher than ever. As the lead flight attendant, Amber was tasked with overseeing the service in first class. The assignment was both an honor and a challenge, a chance to prove her growth under the most scrutinized conditions. She prepared meticulously, reviewing the passenger list and anticipating potential issues. Among the VIPs was an influential billionaire philanthropist, Mr. Graham Carter. Known for his sharp demeanor and exacting standards, Mr. Carter was both admired and feared. Amber knew that handling him would be a delicate balance. As passengers boarded, Amber greeted each one warmly, her professionalism shining through. Mr. Carter was among the last to arrive. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded authority, his piercing gaze scanning the cabin as he approached his seat. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," Amber said with a genuine smile. "Welcome aboard. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." Mr. Carter gave a curt nod, but said nothing, his attention already focused on his tablet. Amber didn't take it personally. She had learned not to let passengers' moods affect her demeanor. A brewing storm. The flight took off smoothly, and Amber began her rounds in first class, ensuring each passenger received the attention and care they expected. Most were polite and appreciative, though some required more patience. Mr. Carter, however, remained aloof, speaking only when necessary. About an hour into the flight, turbulence shook the plane. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to rattle some passengers. Amber immediately activated the seatbelt sign and moved through the cabin, reassuring those who appeared uneasy. In the midst of the turbulence, a problem arose. One of the passengers in first class, a journalist named Ms. Linda Rivera, accidentally spilled her drink on Mr. Carter's lap. The scene unfolded quickly. The splash of liquid, the startled gasp, and Mr. Carter's sharp intake of breath as he looked down at his now stained trousers. "I am so sorry," Ms. Rivera exclaimed, grabbing a napkin. "It was the turbulence. I didn't mean to." Mr. Carter's face hardened. "Unbelievable," he muttered, brushing at the stain with a look of disdain. "This is exactly why I avoid commercial flights." Amber, having witnessed the incident from a few rows away, hurried to intervene. She crouched beside Mr. Carter, her voice calm and steady. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the inconvenience. Let me assist you." He looked at her, his expression skeptical. "And how exactly do you plan to fix this?" he asked, his tone laced with irritation. Amber didn't flinch. "We have a cleaning solution on board that can help with the stain," she said. "I'll also bring you a fresh towel. If you'd like, I can arrange for your suit to be professionally cleaned upon arrival." Mr. Carter hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. Amber moved quickly, retrieving the cleaning supplies and towel from the galley. She worked efficiently, dabbing at the stain with care. Ms. Rivera, meanwhile, continued to apologize profusely. "Accidents happen," Amber said gently, addressing both of them. "The important thing is that we're all safe. Let's focus on resolving this together." Her calm demeanor seemed to diffuse the tension. Mr. Carter, though still displeased, softened slightly. "Thank you," he said gruffly as Amber handed him the fresh towel. The unexpected compliment. By the time the turbulence subsided and the cabin returned to normal, Amber felt a wave of relief. She had navigated the situation without letting it escalate, demonstrating the poise and professionalism she had worked so hard to cultivate. As the flight continued, Amber checked on Mr. Carter periodically, ensuring he was comfortable. To her surprise, he engaged her in conversation during one of these visits. "You handled that well," he said, his tone less brusque than before. "Most people would have fumbled under pressure." Amber smiled, though she felt a pang of self-awareness. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I've learned that staying calm makes all the difference." He studied her for a moment. "You've been in this role for a while, haven't you?" "Yes," Amber replied. "But I've come to realize there's always more to learn." Mr. Carter nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Wise words," he said. "Keep that attitude, and you'll go far." A message from Mrs. Hayes. When the plane landed in Washington, D.C., Amber felt a sense of accomplishment. The flight had been challenging, but she had risen to the occasion. As the passengers disembarked, she received polite thanks and occasional compliments. Mr. Carter, to her surprise, shook her hand before leaving. Later that evening, as Amber settled into her hotel room, she received another email from Mrs. Hayes. Her heart raced as she opened it. Subject: Observations ****. Dear Amber, I've received a detailed report about your performance on today's flight. It seems you were faced with a challenging situation involving one of our more demanding passengers. I want to commend you for your composure, empathy, and problem-solving skills. These are the qualities that define a true professional. You've come a long way since our first meeting, but remember, growth is a continuous journey. The true measure of success is not perfection but perseverance. Keep striving for excellence, and never forget the impact of your actions on those around you. Sincerely, Eleanor Hayes. Amber felt a swell of pride and gratitude as she read the email. Mrs. Hayes' words were a reminder of how far she had come, and how much further she could go. For the first time in months, Amber felt a sense of peace. She wasn't just working toward redemption. She was becoming the person she had always aspired to be. Her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Redemption realized. Amber stood at the airport gate, watching passengers file onto the aircraft for what was to be the most significant flight of her career. This wasn't an ordinary flight. It was the airline's inaugural sustainability-focused route, marking the launch of its new fleet of eco-friendly planes. On board were executives, environmental advocates, and a select group of media representatives, all eager to witness the airline's ambitious step into the future. Amber had been handpicked to lead the crew, a testament to how far she had come. The honor wasn't lost on her, though she couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility. The stakes were high, not just for the airline, but for her personally. Mrs. Hayes had entrusted her with this moment, and Amber was determined not to let her down. The flight of expectations, the buzz of excitement in the cabin, was palpable as the passengers settled into their seats. Amber moved with purpose, greeting each person warmly and ensuring that everything was in perfect order. Among the passengers were familiar faces. Mr. Lewis, the stern executive who had once scrutinized her every move. Mr. Graham Carter, the billionaire philanthropist she had impressed months earlier. And most notably, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes herself. Amber's heart skipped a beat when she saw Mrs. Hayes board. The elderly woman carried herself with her usual quiet dignity, her eyes scanning the cabin as if she were assessing the airline's very soul. When her gaze landed on Amber, she offered a faint nod, neither overly warm nor distant, but enough to remind Amber of the implicit expectations. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," Amber said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "It's an honor to have you with us today." Mrs. Hayes smiled slightly. "Good afternoon, Amber. I trust you'll make this a memorable flight." Amber nodded. "I'll do my best." A mid-flight crisis. The flight began smoothly, with Amber and her crew executing their duties flawlessly. The eco-friendly features of the new aircraft were a topic of fascination, and Amber took the time to explain them to passengers, demonstrating her knowledge and enthusiasm for the airline's mission. However, as the plane reached cruising altitude, an unexpected issue arose. A journalist seated in the economy section, Ms. Karen Holt, began experiencing symptoms of an allergic reaction. She had inadvertently consumed a snack containing nuts, unaware of the potential risk. Amber was alerted immediately and rushed to the scene. Ms. Holt's breathing was labored, and her face was beginning to swell. Panic rippled through the cabin as passengers nearby watched anxiously. Amber knelt beside Ms. Holt, speaking calmly to both her and the surrounding passengers. "Ms. Holt, I'm here to help," she said. "We have an epinephrine auto-injector on board, and I'll administer it right away." She motioned for one of her team members to retrieve the medical kit and began reassuring Ms. Holt. "You're going to be okay. Just keep breathing as steadily as you can." When the auto-injector arrived, Amber administered it with practiced precision, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, Ms. Holt's breathing improved, and the swelling began to subside. Amber stayed by her side, monitoring her condition and keeping her calm until the situation was fully under control. Recognition from Mrs. Hayes. Once Ms. Holt was stable, Amber checked in with the captain to confirm that a medical team would meet the plane upon landing. She then returned to the first-class cabin, where Mrs. Hayes was waiting for her. The elderly woman's expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a glint of something Amber couldn't quite place. "You handled that well," Mrs. Hayes said, her tone measured. "Thank you," Amber replied, still catching her breath. "It's part of the training." Mrs. Hayes shook her head. "Training only goes so far. What I saw was composure, empathy, and leadership. Those qualities can't be taught." Amber felt a flush of pride, but kept her response humble. "I just did what needed to be done." Mrs. Hayes smiled faintly. "That's exactly what makes you stand out." A gesture of gratitude. As the flight neared its destination, Amber made her way back to check on Ms. Holt, who was resting comfortably. The journalist looked up at Amber with a weak but grateful smile. You saved me, Miss Holt said. Thank you. Amber knelt beside her seat. I'm just glad you're okay. Is there anything else you need? Miss Holt shook her head. You've done more than enough. And I have to say, you're not what I expected when I heard about that incident with Mrs. Hayes. Amber stiffened slightly but nodded. I've learned a lot since then. Miss Holt studied her for a moment. Well, whatever you've learned, it shows. I'll be writing about this flight, and you can be sure your name will be mentioned. For all the right reasons. Amber felt her chest tighten, this time with gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. A private conversation. After the plane landed and the passengers disembarked, Amber found herself alone with Mrs. Hayes in the empty cabin. The silence felt heavy, charged with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Hayes gestured for Amber to sit beside her in one of the first-class seats. For a moment, the elderly woman said nothing, her gaze drifting to the window. Amber, Mrs. Hayes began, her voice thoughtful. When we first met, I saw potential in you. But potential is meaningless without action. Today, I saw the person you've become, not just a flight attendant, but a leader. Amber's throat tightened. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. That means a lot to me. Mrs. Hayes turned to face her, her expression softened. You've earned my trust, Amber. And more importantly, you've earned the trust of your passengers and your crew. That's no small feat. Amber felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them away. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, she said. You gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Mrs. Hayes smiled, her eyes twinkling. Second chances are rarely given, but you've made the most of yours. And for that, I'm proud. The words hit Amber with the weight of their sincerity. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of redemption, not because she had erased her past mistakes, but because she had learned from them, grown from them, and become someone better. The journey ahead. As Amber left the plane that day, she felt lighter, as though a burden she had carried for months had finally lifted. Her journey wasn't over. Mrs. Hayes' words reminded her that growth was a continuous process, but she felt ready for whatever lay ahead. Amber no longer worked to prove herself. Instead, she worked to honor the values she now held dear: respect, humility, and integrity. And with each flight, she carried with her the lessons she had learned, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. Redemption, she realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and she was finally on the right path.